All right, the next type of indirect use value are called supporting services. And these are services that support other services. So these are things that ecosystems do that are needed so that we can get those other direct or indirect services or indirect uses. So some examples of this are like providing habitat for game animals, primary productivity that is supporting these other services like drought resistance or climate regulation. Sometimes these are difficult to distinguish between regulating services because a single ecosystem process may result in a regulating service and a supporting service for other types of ecosystem service. So this can be confusing. So an example here is that primary production can sequester carbon, but it can also provide forage for livestock and habitat for game species. So this one thing, primary production, can be both a regulating service for sequestering carbon, but it's also a supporting service by providing food for livestock and habitat for game species. So it starts to get a little bit messy because we're getting multiple values from single things. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. But basically, a supporting service supports other services. Like we couldn't have the other service without these services from ecosystems. The next type of indirect use values are cultural values. And this includes amenity values, which is basically recreation, spiritual or religious values, education, and art. So amenity value, tourism. Now, some of you, I'd like you to look at these pictures on the right. These are all taken from some of our famous national parks in the United States, which represent a lot of amenity value to our country. So I want you to look and see if you can recognize these places and tell me what they are. And some of you may have been to some of these places. So on the top, we have a picture from Yosemite. In the middle, this is Yellowstone National Park, and at the bottom is Grand Canyon. And lots of people visit these three parks every year. And so amenity value is the monetary value of these recreational activities, including hiking, bird watching, photography, and they can be really economically important for local communities. So restaurants and hotels and grocery stores, souvenir shops, things like that are right near places that people want to go visit for their recreational values of ecosystems can bring in a lot of money into these local economies. The U.S. national parks receive 250 million visitors a year, which is a lot. We get tourists coming from all over the world to see some of these places. So the last time I was at Grand Canyon, I was having trouble getting through the trail because there were so many Japanese tourists on the trail. So there are people coming and spending money from other parts of the world to see the natural resources that we have here in the United States, and that creates value. Does anybody know what the most visited national park in the United States is? It's actually the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is in North Carolina and Tennessee. Part of the reason is probably because it's kind of by itself. A lot of the big national parks are out west, and there aren't a ton of national parks in the east. And Great Smoky Mountains gets a lot of visitors from some of the large cities nearby. So places like Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Knoxville and Nashville, Tennessee. People will come to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, people come from all over the world, but that is our park that is the most visited. And the total recreation value of public lands, so not just national parks, but national forests and national wildlife refuges, is estimated to be about $84 billion per year. So really large amount of value for our country. And we also get a lot of ecosystem services from these lands as well. So amenity value, some of the public lands uses are consumptive, means that things get used up, but a lot of times the amount spent on the activity outweighs the value of the resource used. So consumptive uses of our public lands would include things like hunting and fishing, scientific collecting is one, going to collect berries or mushrooms, things like that, are actually consumptive uses. They get used once and it gets used up. But a lot of times people spend a lot more money to go hunt or to go fish than they actually get in value from like the meat that they bring home. So, and the license fees, so you have to have a license to go hunting and fishing. That money goes towards conservation and to maintaining those lands so we can keep having these game species available. But a lot of the money also goes to other species. So by protecting areas for game species, there's also some protection going to non-game species. Ecotourism also goes into amenity values, and ecotourism is about 20% of the total tourism industry, so a decent chunk, and it's estimated to be about $600 billion per year. Obviously, this year there's not as many people traveling around doing any kinds of tourism, so it's probably a lot lower this year. But generally, in a normal year without coronavirus, there is a large amount of money going towards ecotourism. And thinking about sustainable ecotourism is important. And so this flow chart kind of looks at other values of ecosystem tourism in terms of education, environment protection. It's not always perfect, but there's a lot of good things that often come out of ecotourism. Some potential pitfalls, sometimes only a small percentage of the money makes it to the local community. So it may mostly go to larger tour operators or to more luxurious hotels nearby, things like that. And ecotourism may also expose sensitive resources to harm. An example of that is there's been a lot of concern, people going to visit mountain gorillas, and primates can often get the same pathogens that people have. So actually, well before coronavirus, they were requiring people to wear masks to go see the mountain gorillas in the wild, because if you transmitted a cold to a gorilla, it could actually be very harmful to the gorillas, much more harmful than it is to most people. Sometimes ecotourism also shows what is kind of referred to as a sanitized fantasy, meaning that you're only seeing the nice part and you don't see any of the problems, and they deliberately try to hide some of the environmental problems from the tourist to make it look like this wonderful place that you want to go, whereas it may not be as wonderful as it looks. And so this is an kind of a cartoon illustrating that, where we have the tourists up front and they're seeing this beautiful picture of Africa with the animals, but behind it we see that there's actually like a major drought going on, and there's places where the environment isn't being taken care of as well, but those are hidden from the tourists. There's also a lot of indirect use values that come in the form of art. And so many of the great artists were actually inspired by natural environments. And I'm wondering if any of you guys can recognize some of these. Obviously, the book here, this is Walden by Henry David Thoreau, one of our famous American authors. And he says he goes out into the woods to live deliberately. And he lives by Walden Pond for a while, and he writes this whole book. It's got some nice nature parts in it, but it's not my favorite book. He kind of drones on for a long time, but a lot of people really love this book. So if you love this book, I'm not meaning to disparage it in any way. But you might recognize some of these other famous artists. So this one right here, this is a photograph by Ansel Adams, who is a famous American photographer, and he's famous for taking these stark, beautiful black and white photographs of a lot of our national parks. Down here on the bottom left is a painting by Claude Monet, and he's famous for painting the water lilies. This one right here is Georgia O'Keeffe, who is an American, or was an American painter, famous for painting a lot of different flowers and southwestern landscapes. And then some of you may recognize this person. This is Misty Copeland doing Swan Lake. And she is the first African American principal ballerina in the United States for the New York City Ballet. So the last kind of cultural value I want to talk about are spiritual and religious values. And many people in religions value nature. Some people do it in a non-organized religion, just it's part of their spirituality is going out into nature. But even some organized religions, there is a lot to believe and that's related to the environment in terms of these religious values. So in Christianity and Judaism, there are a lot of churches that believe in something called creation care. And basically they believe that because God created nature, that it's their job to take care of nature. And that it would be disrespectful to God to exploit those resources unsustainably or cause extinctions because that's not taking care of something that God created. Buddhism is one that people often think about because they believe that all life is sacred and they try not to harm living things. And many Buddhists and Hindus are actually vegetarian as part of these beliefs, but they also try not to harm any living things, particularly animals, as they go do their, as they work and live through their life. There's lots of other religions that have values for nature. These are just a couple of examples that I highlight, and because our country, or at least our area of the country, has a lot of Christianity, I wanted to highlight the creation care in particular because that might resonate with some of you as a reason to take care of the environment.